Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is dedicated by David Eisenstein in memory of Chana Bat Yehuda Yosef Ravin, in memory of my aunt Hannah Ravin, whose life and family inspire us in our commitment to Jewish life and learning. We're going to start at the very top of our daf, right after the end of the Mishnah. If you remember, we talked about a sukkah that's on the top of a wagon or on a boat. And we said it's kshera v'olina b'yom tov. It's kosher, and meaning it's a good sukkah, and you can go in and use it on Yom Tov. So the Mishnah, the Gemara starts off with that first case and says, Mani matnitin. According to who is this Mishnah? Rabbi Akiva, we're now going to learn that not everybody agreed about this. Ditanya, ha'uses sukkata b'rosh haspina. If you make a sukkah at the top of a boat, Rabban Gamliel posel, the Rabbi Akiva machshir. Rabban Gamliel says this is not a good sukkah. You can't make a sukkah on a boat. And Rabbi Akiva says, of course you can. Why not? Maaseh Rabban Gamliel v'Rabbi Akiva shayu ba'im b'sfina. Now we're going to hear a story. In fact, we hear a lot of stories about Rabbi Akiva and Rabban Gamliel on boats. They must have traveled on boats a lot for business. So there was a case where they were coming on a boat. Amad Rabbi Akiva v'asa sukkah b'rosh hasfina. Rabbi Akiva built a sukkah on the boat. The next day, a wind came, blew the sukkah off. Amar lo Rabban Gamliel, Akiva, hechan sukkatcha. He said to him, Akiva, where's your sukkah? Right? This is classic. I told you so. Right? What are you doing building a sukkah? Of course it was going to blow over. And therefore, of course, it's not a good sukkah. Right? I'm obviously right. So now we're going to talk about what exactly is the machloket between them. You already see that according to Rabbi Akiva, you need something more stable. And it seems like, according to Rabban Gamliel, you need something much more stable. According to Rabbi Akiva, it's really okay. Amal Abaye said, now we're going to discuss exactly what the machloket is about. Dekule alma, everyone agrees. We're now going to talk about, get the terminology before we even go into it. There's ruach mitzuya v'yabasha, which is a typical wind of land, right? Your typical wind that you would find when you're on land. We all know that when you go to the beach, it's much windier, right? Anytime you're on water, it's much windier. So there's typical winds by land and there's typical winds by water. And the atypical wind by land seems to be, at least according to many of the commentaries here, equated with an atypical wind on land seems to be equated with a typical wind on the sea. Now, you would think we're talking about a boat. So one would assume you would need a typical wind on a boat, not a typical wind on land. Why would we be talking about land? So let's see what Abaye says. Both Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva agree. If it can't stand in a typical wind on land, obviously, lo klumhu. Okay? Even though we're on the water, right? Even Rabbi Akiva will agree, if you make such a flimsy sukkah that won't even stand in a regular wind on land, of course it's not a sukkah. If it can stand up to an atypical wind on land, then even Rabban Gamliel would say, if you build such a sukkah on a boat, and it'll stand up to an atypical wind on land, which means a typical wind on the water, again, assuming we equate those, then even Rabban Gamliel will agree that it's okay because it's stable. Kipligi. So what's the machloket? Now it depends on your version here. Okay, so let's just stop for a minute. Their argument is it could stand up to a typical wind on land, but it can't stand up to, now either the version that appears here is in an atypical wind on land, or in Masoret Hashas it says, maybe it should say beruach mitzuyad yam, a typical wind for the land, for the water. Now again, we said maybe those two are equated, so really maybe there's really no difference in terms of the versions here. The point is, the machloket is, it can stand up on land, but it can't stand up on the water, right? Or it can't stand up to an atypical wind on land. That's when they have a machloket. Now, what's the machloket? So here goes. Rabban Gamliel saval sukkah dirat keva be'inan. Kevan de'ina yochola la'amod beruach mitzuyad yam lo klumi. You need a solid, stable place. It has to be dirat keva. Again, we've seen this machloket. Does it need to be dirat keva? Does it need to be dirat arai? Is it okay if it's only temporary? Rabban Gamliel says you need something more solid. Therefore, it has to stand up to this wind on the sea. Rabbi Akiva savar sukkah dirat arai b'inan. It only needs to be something temporary, and therefore, we don't care if it stands up on the water. Now, this is a little strange. Are we building it on the water? It's in a boat. So the Brisker Rav basically says that we're talking about basic laws of mechitzas and of what's solid, what's not solid. It doesn't make a difference that it's going to be on a boat. We don't care what the wind is like where it is. The point is, does this qualify as a sukkah or not by the strict definitions of what is a sukkah? So a sukkah needs to be something that can stand up to a typical wind on land, even though it maybe won't be able to stand up to an atypical wind on land. So according, right, that's Rabbi Akiva's position. Since this can't stand up to an atypical wind, that doesn't bother us. We just need something temporary. And sukkah is defined in this way, and therefore that's sufficient. Now we're going to get to our case on the camel. And from here, we're going to get on an interesting tangent all about different animals and different halachas that one could or could not use animals. You might remember this. We had it also in Eruvin. So first, we're going to start off with a sukkah on a camel. So as I mentioned in the Oktumim, they used to have the sukkah on a camel. It seems very, what about tsar balei chayim? It's unpleasant for the animal. How could you possibly sit in it? What about 7 by 7 tefachim, handbreadths, right? It would have to be, you'd have to have a sukkah big enough, which would be hard to imagine that on a camel. Obviously, it has to have all those criteria. But the point is, this is probably more of a theoretical discussion. I don't really believe, and certainly when we get to cases of elephants functioning as walls of a sukkah, you're going to be thinking, okay, this is really not commonplace, normal. Probably, and you almost think maybe they're even joking around about this a little bit. In other words, not joking around in the sense that they're mocking things, but they're using this as an example for defining what counts as a mechitza, what counts as a sukkah, what counts as all these different issues. So first we're dealing, and I want to be clear here, first we're dealing with a sukkah on top of a camel. Later, we're going to move into a bit of a different topic, which is if the animal functions as a wall of a sukkah. Those are two very different issues, and it's a little confusing here because the Gemara brings one right after the other. This common denominator is just that we're talking about animals. But beyond that, it's very different because one is the sukkah itself is complete. It's just on top of an animal. And the other is that the animal is making up parts of the sukkah. So it's a different issue. Otherwise, you'll get confused because you'll see that Rabbi Meir is lenient in one and says the animal's okay in this one. But in the case of the wall, he's not going to allow it. But they don't have to do with the same issue. So now we had ol gabei kamal. You can have it on a camel. So again, the Gemara is going to say, Madniti Mane, who is this Mishnah according to? Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Tanya, as it says in a Braita, Rabbi Meir machshir, Rabbi Yehuda posel. Rabbi Meir is the one who allows this. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't allow it. My Tamid Rabbi Yehuda, what's his reason? Amal ka, chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim. It says in the pasuk. Now you might have said, first of all, by the way, before we even get to this, or maybe as we get to this, the best answer would have been he holds sukkah dirat keva, and it's not keva if it's on a camel. For whatever reason, he doesn't say that. It may be because there's an additional issue here. So here it's a very specific issue. It says in the pasuk, Chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim. Now we already taught that this verse is all about building the sukkah, and the sukkah has to be not just the holiday of Sukkot, but the Sukkot of the holiday. Sukkah ruya l'shiv'ah shma sukkah. Sukkah she'ena ruya l'shiv'ah lo shma sukkah. In order for it to be a good sukkah, it has to be usable for 7 days. Now, everyone agreed in the Mishnah that you can't go, well, there was only one opinion in the Mishnah, but the point was, the sukkah is kosher, but you can't go in it on Yom Tov because you might end up, since you're on an animal, you might want the animal to move and you might grab a branch and rip it. So and tear it off. That's a problem on Shabbat because of that, or Yom Tov as well. Therefore, we say this sukkah can't be used all 7 days of the holiday. It can't be used on Yom Tov. It can't be used on Shabbat. So therefore, it's not a good sukkah. You need a sukkah that could work for all 7 days. That's what he learns from Chag Sukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim. Should be made for you this holiday for 7 days. For Rabbi Meir, what does he say? He doesn't think this? Well, in fact, he does think this. But what does he say? The whole issue of not using the sukkah on Shabbat or Yom Tov is because of a gzerat Rabbanan, a rabbinic ordinance. But from the Torah, you can actually go into the sukkah on Shabbat. It's only just in case you would break something and then use it, right? And once you break it, it's forbidden. But just going on the camel itself on a Torah level is not prohibited. Therefore, he says, Hanami midoraita mechza chazia. This is worthy to go into on all of the 7 days on a Torah level. Now, rabbinic level, so you can't, but in a theoretic level, on a Torah level, it's fine. Therefore, Rabbananu de Gazru, it's only the rabbis that did it, and therefore he thinks it's okay. That's section 1. Now we're moving on to a different, and I said, don't get confused between these two because this is something different. Since we talked about using animals in relation to Sukkah, we're now going to talk about using animals of a wall of a Sukkah. Here, Rabbi Meir is going to be stringent, but for a different reason. If you made your animal a wall of a Sukkah, Rabbi Meir posel, the Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Meir says this is no good. You can't use an animal for a wall of your sukkah. Thank God, right? Because that sounds a little crazy. But in fact, Rabbi Yehuda allows this, which is interesting because Rabbi Yehuda has always been so stringent and you need tirakeva, you need to be worthy for 7 days. He seems to say this is not a problem. Shaya Rabbi Meir Omer. Now we're going to get more into Rabbi Meir's opinion. Kol davar sheyesh b'ruach chayim, anything that lives and breathes, Eino sinoto, and now he's going to give a list. Lo dofen l'sukkah, not a wall for a sukkah. Lo lechi lemavoy, not a post, one of those posts that sits on the side of the lechi to allow carrying. Velo pasim lebiraot, those are those dumadim. These are these two, right? You have these corner pieces, they jut out in each corner that they would make in order to allow the people to feed water to their animals on the Aliyah L'Regel. When they would come in on Shabbat, they needed to be able to bring their animals to the water. They'd be able to carry the water or be able to use that space. They made these 4 posts on the side, and that would enclosed around. It wasn't really fully enclosed, just on the edges, but that created this thing that allowed people to be able to take the water out for their animals. So now, and they could carry within that space. So you can't use an animal as one of those posts on the pasei biraot, on the biraot, the pasim or the posts. Velo gola lakever. This is a totally separate issue from all the others. If you put they would use stones often to cover a grave or other things. If you would put an animal as a cover to a grave, again, of seemingly strange use, it wouldn't have laws of impurity applicable to it. Why is that? Because anything that's alive doesn't carry impurity, right? Any animal that's alive. Person could become impure, but animals only become impure, susceptible to impurity when they die. Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili Amru, he adds an additional one. Amru af ein kotvim alav gitei nashim. It's another strange one to think that you could take the animal, right, the hide of an animal, write on its skin, and then write the get on the skin, and then give it to a person's wife. Okay, you can't do that. You can't use a live animal for that. This is all for a different reason, and that's why only Rabbi Yossi adds this. He has a different reason based on the verse. We'll get to this another time. My time is Rabbi Meir. The question is, what's Rabbi Meir's reason why he won't allow the following list of items? So we're going to have a machlok at Abaye and Rabbi Zeir. Abaye amar shema tamut. Maybe the animal will die. What's the issue if the animal will die? So the issue is a little different in some of the cases. If it's the wall of a sukkah, then, okay, let's actually start with the pasei biraot and the lechi for the mavoi. Those both permit carrying in a particular area. Let's say you're carrying in that area and you don't notice because you're in the area and the space, you don't see that behind you, let's say, the animal dies. So you'll end up carrying in a space that's not actually permitted to carry. So that's very logical. What about a wall of a sukkah? If you're sitting in the sukkah and you see all the walls, you'll see that the animal has died. So why is it such a concern? Once you see, you won't sit in your sukkah. So some people explain that the concern is that you'll see, you might see, but then it'll be bitul mitzvah. You won't be able to do the mitzvah. Rashi says this. So somebody looks like, why is he saying now you won't be able to do the mitzvah? The assumption is, well, now it's true that you'll notice the animal's dead, but now you won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah because you don't have a sukkah anymore. But let's say you don't live in a place where you can go find your neighbor's sukkah. Right? Nowadays, we're blessed that many people have neighbors who they could use, but let's say you don't. So then you'll be stuck and you won't have a sukkah. So that's why you shouldn't use your animal as a wall of your sukkah. Okay. Golela kever, again, as we said, is a bit of a different issue, but still, okay, that seems to be not exactly the same thing. So Abaye says Shema Tamut. Rabbi Zera Amar Shema Tivrach. the animal might run away. And then again, the same problem. You won't have your lechi, your mavoi, right? Your sukkah wall, it'll be a problem. So now they're going to explain this machloket, and then we're going to try to figure out how this works out with both their opinions, etc. Bipil kashur kole amalopli. If it's an elephant that's tied up, and you want to use that as your wall of your sukkah or your lechi or your mavoi, whatever it is. Your lechi for your mavoi, your pas for your biraot. So if it's the animal is tied, and if it's the elephant, you'll see in a minute why we're talking about an elephant. Kule amalopli. Nobody disagrees. Dinami mait. If it were to die, it's actually going to be fine. Why? If it were to die, yesh benivlato asara. Appeal, now you know why we said an elephant. If an elephant dies, there's no problem because you still have a 10 tefachim high wall because the elephant is so large that it'll still be 10 tefachim high even when it's dead. Now you have to ask another question really, which is, wait a minute. First of all, there's a whole sukkah about tefillin and not using non-kosher animals. And there it seems to also talk about the fact that mitzvot shouldn't be used you shouldn't use non-kosher animals in general for a mitzvah. So how could you be building your sukkah with an elephant, which isn't a kosher animal? That's number one. Number two, nevela. Forget about kosher or non-kosher, the animal's alive. When the animal dies, there's a few issues. First of all, nevela carries impurity. What again? We're going to allow that for use to build your sukkah. Number two, it smells awful, a dead animal. So what you're going to, and it's going to attract bees and, disgusting. So now you're going to allow, remember Abaye said the wormwood has a terrible smell and everyone's going to want to leave the sukkah. So that should be another problem. So there's a lot of questions here, why they don't raise those issues, but let's move on. Okay. They don't raise those issues. Some of the commentaries comment, but let's move on in any case, but I wanted to not ignore the fact that those are also potential issues. So now they say, but assuming you have this tied up elephant, so if it dies, we don't have to worry about it. So there we dealt with Shema Tamut because it's still going to have a wall that's 10 high. But, and obviously they don't say this, but it's obvious. If it's tied, then you don't have to worry, it'll run away. So therefore it must be, kipligi, the machloket is, but pil she'eno kashor, in an elephant that's not tied. Tied, we mean bound, right? Or tied to the sukkah in a way that it can't run away. Lemanda mal shema tamut. So if it's not tied at all, the one who says shema tamut lo cheshina, because we already said it's an elephant. Lemanda amar gzera shema tivrach cheshinan. But if you say where it's going to run away, since it's not tied, you have to worry. So in that case, that must be the machloket when Abaye and Rabbi Zera would say would have a difference of opinion. But now they say, wait a minute, if it's not tied, if it's not tied. Here, Lamanda Amar Gzera Shema Tamut. If it's not tied, but we're not worried it's going to run away, right? Because we were worried Shema Tamut, that's our concern. But we said, if that's our concern, we don't have to worry in this case. But wait a minute. Nichu Shema Tivrach. But why isn't he worried? Maybe the elephant will run away. That should be a concern for everybody. So therefore, they say that's not the case. It must be. Even the one who says Shema Tamut, which is Abaye, would also think the Rabbi Meir is concerned that maybe it'll run away. In which case, we have to shift what the case was, where they disagree. If the animal's not tied, everyone agrees it's a problem because the animal could run away. Even Abaye will say it's a problem. Their machloket is behemak shura, is when the animal is tied. Now we're going to explain it differently. We are worried that maybe it'll die. So now we're going to say, the one who says, so now what I forgot to mention is their argument is not about an elephant. It's about a different type of animal, an animal that if it dies, it's going to be less than 10. So therefore, they don't argue in an elephant case at all, only argue in a regular animal. So now we're going to go back to the original question though, right? So if you say you're going to run away, you don't have to worry because it's tied up. But if you're worried it might die, well, then you'll have to worry and then you'll have a wall that's less than 10 tefachim high. But again, they're going to ask now the reverse. But why isn't the one who says maybe it'll run away? Why isn't he worried that maybe it'll die? So what do they answer? Mita lo shchicha. Mita is very uncommon. Death is not it's not likely that the animal is going to happen to die while you're using it for a wall. And we don't worry about things that are so uncommon. So that's the answer. Now they're going to ask all sorts of other questions. Wait a minute. you want to use this animal as your wall for a sukkah. There's technical problems, sukkah-related issues that we've been learning all along. What about the space in between their legs? It's all open, less than 3 tvachim. So, I'm sorry, more than 3 tvachim of space. How can you possibly have a wall there? So they say, they fill in the gaps with shrubbery and stuff. But maybe the animal will crouch down. Why aren't we worried about that? It'll be less than 10 tvachim high. They tie it with ropes up to the top so that it stays at a certain height. Well, then they say, wait a minute, that's a problem though. If you're going to say that, why don't you, if you're holding it up, then we don't have to worry that when it dies, it'll be less than 10. It'll still be held up by these ropes. Now it's getting a very unpleasant image. This dead animal hanging with ropes to the top of your sukkah. So what are the answer? Well, remember laws of Levud. We can put our wall less than 3 tvachim away from the roof, meaning that it's possible the animal will just be 7 and a bit. And then we use Levud to get it to 10. If the animal dies, what might happen? Kevin de maite kavtza. The body shrinks a little bit. So while it's true, while it's alive, it's hanging at exactly 7 and a bit, and we can use Levud to get to 10. But if it shrinks a little, shrivels up, then we're not going to have that height. And then it's going to be less than 7, and then we won't be able to use Levud, and then you won't have a good wall. So that's why the tying the ropes won't help you. So we do tie the ropes, and that helps you if it's alive, but it's not going to help you if it dies. And therefore, the one who says Shema Tamud is still going to have an issue. And the lavadata. And what they say is here, and you won't even notice because it shrivels a little, right? It just goes between that a little above 7 to a little below 7. You won't even notice, and you'll end up thinking the sukkah is kosher, and it turns out it's not. Now we have a big question, though. According to Abaye, the whole issue is Gzera Shema Tamud. And Rabbi Meir is concerned, and Rabbi Yehuda is not, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda says it's okay. But is that really what Abaye says? Abaye says exactly the opposite in another sukkah. The Hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, Bat Yisrael shenisei lekohen, v'halach ba'ala lemedinat hayam. Daughter of a Yisrael who gets to eat truma while she's married to a Kohen. So she marries a Kohen, she eats truma, but now her husband goes abroad. And when people go abroad, we have no idea, are they ever going to come home or not? So she's ochela betruma becheskat shu kayam. We don't assume maybe he died. So she can continue to eat truma. Ureminan ala, but there's a contradiction to that Mishnah. It's a Braita in Gitin. It says, Harei ze gitech sha'a achad kodem mitati. Somebody gives his wife a get and says, listen, this will be your get the hour before I die, which really means the moment before I die, which means right now you're not divorced from me. But as soon as I die, this will be your get retroactively from the moment that I die, right? From just the moment just before I die. Why would anyone do such a thing? Very good reason. They don't have children, and he's worried that his wife is going to have to do yibum with his brother. Maybe he doesn't want her to, or maybe the brother doesn't want to and won't want to do yibum or chalitza. Okay, this is if you die without children, the husband dies, the wife is supposed to marry the brother, and if he doesn't want to marry her, he does chalitza. Nowadays, we only do chalitza. The brother never marries the wife. And so if the brother wants to avoid this, by the way, is very common that someone would want to do this nowadays. Not very common, but there's situations like this that come up where, let's say someone's a Baal Tshuva, became religious. This family's not religious at all. He gets married. He dies without children. The wife has to do chalitza with the brother. There are cases that have come up, my husband's had experience with them, where the brother doesn't want to do chalitza. He's not willing. He says, what is this ridiculous ceremony? I don't want to do this. And he won't do it. And the woman becomes an aguna. She's stuck. She can't get married until he does chalitza. It's a very relevant issue. So one could see why a person would want to avoid his wife having to deal with yibum or chalitza. So if he says, this is your get, as the moment before I die, if she's a Yisrael, about Yisrael, the daughter of a Yisrael, she's married to a Kohen, she can't eat truma immediately, because if he were to die at any moment, the moment before, she won't be able to eat truma. So every moment is possible he might die. So what would you say? That's concern Shema Tamut, right? We're always worried, maybe Shema Yamut in this case, maybe he'll die. So in the case of the woman whose husband goes abroad, we're not worried and we allow her to eat truma. But in this case, we don't allow her to eat truma because we're worried. So this was a contradiction brought. Va'amar Abaye lo kashya ha-Rabbi Meir chayish lamita, de lo chayish lamita, ha-Rabbi Yehuda de chayish lamita. He said, don't worry about that contradiction. One is Rabbi Meir, who says we're concerned for death. And one is Rabbi Meir, who says we're not concerned for death. The one that said the woman can't eat truma anymore, that's Rabbi Meir. He's always worried, Shema Tamut. I'm sorry, the opposite. That's Rabbi Yehuda, who's worried, Shema Tamut. And the one about the one that her husband goes abroad and we're not worried and she can continue to eat truma, that's Rabbi Meir, who says we're not worried about the husband dying. So there you see, Rabbi Meir is the one who's not concerned for death, and Rabbi Yehuda is the one who is concerned, and that's the exact opposite by us. Rabbi Meir said, you can't use the animal. Maybe he'll die, according to Abaye. So Abaye himself raises this contradiction. Before we get to the answer, which we're actually not going to get to today, we're going to first explain why he assumed there that Rabbi Meir is the one who's not concerned about death, and Rabbi Yehuda is the one who is concerned. Did Tanya, and we quote this famous case that we've learned already a number of times, Halokech yayin mi ben kutim, if you buy wine from kutim. Kutim, there's a concern, right? Kutim were converts, the Shomronim. They were people who took on Judaism. According to this Gemara, we assume they're Gerei Arayot. They didn't really do it for the right reasons. They're not considered Jews. And we assume that they do not take Trumot and Maslot. So if you bought wine from them, now Toso points out something interesting, which is normally wine from a non-Jew, you're not allowed to drink for other reasons because of Yenesech. We're worried that they offer their libations to gods, to other gods. But Tosfot says clearly that's not what we're worried about when it comes to Kutim. Kutim are not suspect, that they're not idol worshippers. And therefore, they keep the Torah. They just have a different version of the Torah that they keep, right? If you meet Shomronim today, it's almost like Karaim, like the Karaites. It's very similar. They keep a very strict reading. They don't have the rabbinic traditions. So therefore, it's not an issue. You can actually drink their wine, but the problem is you have to take Trumot and Maslot. So now the problem is and now there's a debate about what exactly the issue is. Usually we've learned this. We've said the issue is that this happened right before Shabbat. And you didn't have a chance to take Trumot and Maslot on Shabbat, and now you can't because it's already Shabbat. Tosfot says you can only, by the way, resolve this issue the way we're going to do it now, which we'll see in a minute, only ben hashmashot, when it's half, right? Safek Yom, Safek Laila. There's a few things we're more lenient about, and that this is a leniency of that. Other people seem to say you can even do this on Shabbos, but there's some sort of solution that we can do. So you can't fix your fruits because it's like metaken kli. You're fixing something. You can't do that by taking the Trumot and Maslot, but you can do something else. Some people say this isn't a Shabbos issue. The issue is that you don't have pure vessels to put your wine into, to separate it out, right? With either which way, you can't separate the wine out. Okay, either because it's Shabbat and you can't, or because you don't have vessels to put it in. So what do you do? And then it's not a Shabbat issue at all, according to those. So what you do is you say the following, Omer. And now we're going to start going through all the Trumot and Maslot you have to take. The first thing you have to take is Truma Gdolah. It's 1/50th or 1/40th or 1/60th if you want to do Ayin Yafa, Ayin Ra'ah, but the Benoni is 1 out of 50. So you have, let's say, 100. Omer, you have 100 log. That's a volume measurement. Shnei lugin, shani atil lafrish, 2 log that I will ultimately separate, which I'm not going to do now, but meaning whatever's left at the bottom of the barrel. Basically, you're going to drink this wine, and at the end, you're going to leave over. And when you get to either after Shabbat or you get to a place where you have pure vessels, you're going to pour that amount, all these amounts you're saying, into a separate vessel. Shnei lugin shani atil lafrish, harei hein truma. That's Truma Gdolah, which goes to the kohen. Asara, another 10 from the rest, which is really only 9.8. But they're always not so careful about it because it's a 10th of what's left. There's only 98 left. 9.8 really is Maaser Rishon. That goes to the Levi. That's the Maaser, the 10th. Tisha, 9 from that, which is really even less because now you have 9.8 minus, you end up with 8.8, right? A little bit more than that. You end up, right? So you really need to take 8 like a 10th of that, okay? You have 88.8 or something, right? Again, I'm not doing the exact math, but then you take 10th of that is Maaser Rishon. Okay, so that's Tisha, they say, because again, rounding it off. Umechal v'shotem miyad. By the way, there's 3 different interpretations of the word mechal. Some people say it's mechal, he's mechalel. Okay, the Maaser Sheni is something you're supposed to redeem onto something else. So you redeem it onto something else. Some will say, no, you don't redeem it on Shabbat. Mechal is you start from lahatchil. Mechal v'shotem miyad. You start and you drink right away. Some people say they have a different version. It's mohel. You dilute the wine, because remember, they didn't drink the wine concentrate, they diluted it. Dilute the wine, v'shotem biyad. So 3 different interpretations of what that word is. Some would have it be a halachic thing. According to the other 2, it's not really a halachic thing. Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, osrim. They forbid it. Now, why do they forbid it? They say, and as Rabbi Meir says, it's a great solution. Just say whatever is left, ultimately, right, is fine. The other rabbis say, no, you can't do this. Shema, Rashi says it, Shema yiba kahanod. Now, this is all, by the way, this whole topic is what we call breira, which is retroactive designation. Can I say that whatever's later going to be left, the problem is the wine all gets mixed up. How do I know when I drink this, I'm not drinking the one that's the Truma de Masrot? That's because we could say breira. Rabbi Meir holds breira, and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon don't hold breira, but then there's a question, maybe they do hold breira, and even though they think it's okay, there's a separate problem, which is this problem that we're going to discuss right now, Shema yiba kahanod. The problem is that what if you get a crack? So you do all this, you drink it, and then it cracks before you get to take out all the parts you wanted to separate. Turns out, retroactively, you ended up drinking stuff that had no Truma de Masrot taken from it because you never took them out. So now, what does this have to do with our topic? Well, if you're worried about death, then you're worried about the vessel cracking. Now, even though you might say death and vessel cracking isn't exactly the same thing. But again, it's this idea, do you have to worry about all the possible, terrible possibilities that might happen? Or do you not have to worry about it? Now, notice, Rabbi Meir isn't worried. Rabbi Yehuda is. That's where Abaye gets it when you resolve that contradiction. He said Rabbi Meir is the one who isn't worried. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who is. So now I'm going to leave you with this question, which is, if that's the case, why in our case is Rabbi Meir the one who's concerned for death and Rabbi Yehuda is the one who isn't concerned for death? How can this work out? So I'll leave you with that question and we'll pick up with this tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.